People were ejected from last night's Eurovision semi-final during attempts to disrupt Israel's performance as the song contest faces its biggest ever political boycott. Organisers have issued a formal warning to Israeli broadcaster Kan after its contestant released videos instructing fans to vote 10 times for Israel last weekend. It comes as a report in the New York Times suggests that Israeli attempts to influence Eurovision began years earlier than previously thought. James Vazina has the story.
Behind the results may be a carefully coordinated campaign. That's what a report from the New York Times alleges after journalists accessed voting data leading to Yuval Raphael's score in last year's edition. They found that in some countries, mobilising just a few hundred voters would have been enough to win the Spanish vote. And using data from Spain, where Israel's entry placed first in the popular vote, the New York Times found that Yuval Raphael secured an overwhelming win, taking a third of all votes, with 5 times as many votes as runners-up Ukraine. This despite numerous polls showing that the Spanish public was deeply critical of Israel's government and its war on Gaza. With Eurovision allowing people to vote up to 20 times, support groups as well as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu encouraged people to cast the maximum 20 votes permitted by spreading messages online. With those rules in mind, 482 voters would have been enough to beat Ukraine and claim the popular vote in Spain. Raphael finished second overall in the song contest, and Eurovision has now banned excessive promotion, with votes reduced to a maximum of 10 per person. That didn't stop Israel's 2026 contestant, Noam Betan, from putting out videos calling on people to vote 10 times for Israel.
The stadium full with people.
The Israeli delegation was told by Eurovision officials to remove the videos and put an end to the practice.
Well, for more, we're joined now by Mara Hvistendahl, investigative reporter at the New York Times. Mara, thanks so much for being with us on the programme. Israel, as we know, has been in the spotlight over its participation in Eurovision since the start of the war in Gaza. But you found that Israeli efforts to actually influence the vote were much broader and started years earlier than previously thought. Tell us more.
Yes, so my colleague and I at the New York Times, we were able to show that Israeli efforts, Israeli government intervention in Eurovision started years earlier, in the form of government funding for promotion of its contestants on social media. But it really did pick up with the war in Gaza as public sentiment in Europe was turning against Israel. Eurovision is a contest at which Israel has done quite well in the past, and I think there was clearly an opportunity to win hearts and minds by doing well. Now, the government funded social media ads and waged a campaign of officials and others calling for people to vote the maximum time in 2024 and 2025. The broadcaster itself, which is the one that competes in Eurovision, says that they were not involved. But certainly there were a number of other broadcasters that were upset about the situation that led to the boycott that you see with 5 nations sitting out.
And rather shockingly, as we heard in James's report there, it took just a few hundred votes to swing the result in Israel's favour in some countries and some of the votes. How can it be so easy to manipulate if that's in fact what has happened? An event that, as you say yourself, is the world's most watched cultural competition.
So Eurovision organizers hold the vote data very closely to the extent that some broadcasters themselves do not have full insight into how people in their country voted. We were able to obtain vote data from multiple countries showing that in some situations, the number of people or number of votes cast is quite low. Now, given that people can vote up to 20 times in the past and 10 times this year, that means that it would take a relatively few people to swing the vote. And even though the data is closely held, that's something that that countries that do well at the contest would have known, and potentially could use to their advantage. This is an era where social media promotion it can make or break a contestant, and having a viable campaign on social media could lead to them doing quite well.
And what do you make of how the EBU itself has reacted to all of this? It's made efforts to change the voting rules, but critics say that they're, merely voluntary. They have the number of times that people can vote. But as we saw in that video campaign in favour of the Israeli current contestant, people can still vote up to 10 times. And if they have a VPN, they can change their location and continue to do so. So is the competition actually taking this seriously, and is it doing enough to prevent this kind of manipulation?
Well, you have 5 broadcasters sitting out the contest who say, no. Their concerns range from anger over the war in Gaza and kind of taking a moral ground to actual deeper concerns about the vote and about the integrity of the process, as well as the transparency or lack of transparency at the EBU. So they are upset that they were not given more data. We were able to get internal documents. We interviewed dozens and dozens of people, and that gave us insight into kind of the inner workings of all of this, and we're able to peel back the curtain on what happened over the past year.
And we saw as well in your report the Israeli government spending up to $1 million on marketing. Were you surprised to discover that there's such high-level involvement by the Israeli embassies around the world and by the government itself, when really, at the end of the day, we're just talking about a song contest?
It is just a song contest. It is also the world's most watched cultural event. It is a big stage for Europeans, and it is a stage on which Israel has long sought to do quite well. It was known last year that there was a concerted campaign to potentially influence the vote. We were able to put a dollar amount on that for 1 year, and we were also able to show what the fallout of some of that was. How this past year, I think, nearly broke Eurovision and the EBU, the part that deals with Eurovision apart. And it's people, they're entering the contest now in Vienna on very shaky ground.
And Mara, what do you make of the fact that Israel has managed to make it through to the final? Not much of a surprise on Saturday night. We don't know exactly how the various countries and judging panels voted. Also, just finally, how do you think this controversy is going to affect the Eurovision Song Contest in the longer term?
So Israel is favored to win the popular vote yet again in the odds. What remains to be seen is how the rules changes could affect the outcome, both the rules changes and the 5 countries sitting on the sidelines. And long term, we learned in our reporting that the Eurovision is facing some financial issues. They say they're okay, but they acknowledge to us that they are having difficulty finding sponsors for the contest. There is the other question about whether these 5 countries will ever come back, and what that means for the future of the contest. So and just on a personal note, I know people who are not watching it this year. I think that's the mood in Vienna is a bit different from years past, I've heard. So this is all very much affecting the contest this year.
Mara, we'll have to leave it there for now. Thanks so much for being with us, though, on the programme. That is Mara Hvistendahl, investigative reporter at the New York Times.